Bună ziua! Ne bucurăm să fim împreună cu dumneavoastră la târgul Elefant Fest și numele meu este Dan Romașcanu. Locuiesc în Israel de aproape 4 decenii, dar urmăresc viața culturală, literară din România și din Israel. Colaborez la 2 dintre publicațiile online, site-ul Filme și Cărți și revista Editura de azi a Uniunii Scriitorilor. Am astăzi plăcerea să port un scurt dialog cu doamna Miriam Yahil-Wax, autoarea unei cărți extrem de interesante, apărută recent în România, la Editura Corint. Cartea se numește Capitolul Lipsă și are o poveste foarte interesantă și dânsa are și dânsa o biografie foarte interesantă. Voi trece acum pe limba engleză. Hello, good morning, Miriam.
Hello, Dan. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, and thanks for participating at this dialogue, which is recorded for the Elephant Fest, which is an online event this year, this very special year that we are living through. And it's my pleasure to have you as a guest for the launching in Romania of the printed edition of the book, The Missing Chapter, Capitolul Lipsă, a book which I have read about 3 years ago when it appeared in Hebrew, and which I promoted and desired very much to be published in Romania.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, we meet online. We have never met face-to-face. Actually, maybe once when at the launching of the book, but I was one of the anonymous people in the hall. You were the star of the evening. The launching book, which was actually took place at the University of Tel Aviv in an auditorium with about 200 people present, a very interesting event. And I know that you are an expert in theater. You are a very public figure in the theater life of Israel. You are also the author of theater and drama books. You are also a translator. Yesterday I learned actually that you translated a full shelf of books from Charles Dickens to John le Carré, who is my preferred thriller author. And let me maybe have you fill in a little more details about yourself.
Well, first of all, I want to apologize for not doing this in Romanian. As I said before, my Romanian is that of a 5-year-old, which is the age, about the age that I came from Romania to Israel. But I heard Romanian around me all my life. And my family kept speaking Romanian always. My mother was a great lover of language, and I caught on to it. And at some point, I think I was 14 or 15, I said I wanted to read Romanian. And she gave me a book, strangely enough, of poetry, of Topolceanu. And she said, this will help you read because the rhythm of poetry will make you read correctly. And she was absolutely right. She was absolutely right. Through that, because poetry, you know, it has rhyme and rhythm, and it dictates how you cannot make so many mistakes as you can in prose. So with that book, I learned how to read Romanian, not very well, but well enough to, how shall I say it, să mă descurc. But not very well. I'm not able to read a book in Romanian, but I am able to compare texts in Romanian and English, in Romanian and French, in Romanian and Hebrew. That I can do. But independently, I can't. What else? It's true that I was in the theater all my life, but I always wrote. And this book, The Missing Chapter, came out, as it were. It had a very long birth. I was writing bits and pieces of it from my memory, and for years and years. And then when I tried to put them together, I saw that I had huge gaps in between chapters, chronological gaps and gaps of knowledge. I didn't really know what was going on in Romania at the time that my parents were a young couple. So that is, as it were, a long birth, a long start, and then a pause to go into historical research.
That's very good point, and actually maybe this kind of triggers my next question, because as a reader of this book, shortly, this is I would say it's a documentary novel combined with a memoir, with a personal memoir. And it's a love story, because you are going back researching the years of your parents, and especially the figure of your father, who died basically shortly, a few days. It's part of the story around the date of your birth. So you never met him. But the book is actually extraordinarily documented, and I will maybe say later a few words about where I perceive the value. But there is a lot of accurate information about the interwar.
I lost your voice.
Okay.
Okay, now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is it better? Okay. So I was saying that the documentary level seems extremely good. So I was wondering if you can say a few words about how your process of documenting for the book, which I understand took a long time, was spread along a long period, how it happened.
Well, I'm not a historian. I mean, I have an academic background. I have a PhD in theater. I have an MA in English literature, but I'm not a historian. So I know in principle how to do research, but I don't know how to do historical research. So my historical research, as it were, was triggered by the few letters and documents of my family that I found in a little suitcase. You can see it up there in the corner. But I didn't know really how to do it. So I would just go, let's say, from the date of a letter of my father. One of the first letters was dated 1929, February 28. He said, well, what happened in Romania at that date? And why did the correspondence between him and my father disappear after that? So once you open the history book, you know what happened on that day. The next day, the American stock market crashed and the whole world went into a terrible economic depression, Romania included. So, this is how I did my research, jumping from information that was personal to looking for what happened at that time in Romania and in the world. And so this is not a systematic historical research, you can see. So as I went along, once you get into a piece of history, it became so fascinating to me what happened in Romania during that time that I read more and more about it. So I wasn't writing for a long period of time because the history was so amazingly interesting to me. I knew nothing about it. I had no knowledge of what was going on in Romanian politics, and certainly not about what was going on with Romanian Jews. I had no idea.
To this point, this is actually, I would say, a little bit illustrating the status of information that we have in Israel about the history of Romania. So Romania had actually the second big Jewish community between the two wars. So Poland had around 3 million Jews. Romania was close to 1 million Jews before the Second World War. And yet in Israel, we know very little about the history of the Romanian Jewry and about the Holocaust that happened.
Not only do we know very little, there was this false assumption that everything was fine in Romania for the Jews, that they were all right, that nothing happened to them. And this is completely false.
Exactly. And I would say that from the perspective now, the book is actually a very useful bridge between the Romanian and the Israeli culture, and between the historical perception of the events that took place between the two wars and during the Second World War. In Israel, to be informed about the Romanian Jews and their history, but in Romania also, because there is a perception in Romania about what happened during the Holocaust, about what was the status of the Romanian Jews. There are, of course, a few very well-known writers and cultural figures, people like Mihail Sebastian, Tristan Țara, Benjamin Fundoianu. But those people were, most of them, people who were, how should I say, very assimilated into the Romanian culture. They didn't hide their Jewish origin, but they expressed themselves as Romanian intelligentsia, or in the case of Țara, universal intelligentsia, or of Fundoianu was actually French in culture and most of his works. The perspective that you are offering is actually the perspective of the majority of the Romanians, who were not necessarily intellectuals, and some of them were also attracted by the communist movement. There is very little information, almost none, about what happened with the people who took refuge in the Soviet Union during the World War II. There is one famous novel by Mihail Sadoveanu, Mitra Cocor, which gives a very deformed and propagandistic view of what happened with the Romanian people. Nothing about the Jews. Figures are like your parents, who took refuge in the Soviet Union, came back to be very disappointed about what they found when getting back.
Yeah, the big
Such
dream.
biographies are very little known. So maybe you can say a few words about how you perceive that situation and their biographies.
Well, the first thing is that when we speak of communism today, we are all very wise with hindsight, because we know what happened and we know that it was a terrible debacle, and not just Stalin, but the whole system, this whole, what I call the greatest experiment of human politics, it failed. It failed shamefully and horribly and murderously. But in the 30s, in the interbellum period, many European writers, philosophers, intelligentsia, the most famous is Jean-Paul Sartre, but he was not the only one. They thought that communism was the answer, that it was the solution to the terrible failures of capitalism as shown at the end of World War I. And my father was, and the young Jews had an additional problem at the time. Not only was Romania as a country failing in terms of politics and economics, they were also discriminated against heavily. And they too took after this, wonderful idea of equality, égalité, fraternité, and socialism. And it was a group of idealists to start with. And what happened to them in Romania, you know better than I, was the same thing that happened in Russia. Once they came to power, it all rotted and was corrupted and terrible. But at the time that my father joined this group, they were underground. They were the resistance. They were those who fought to make Romania better. And it was a pipe dream. It turned out to be a pipe dream. At the end of the war, the year after the war, which my parents spent in the Soviet Union, showed them the terrible failure of the system, and also the acceptance with which they were met when they crossed the border early in the war was turned upside down. They were no longer liked. All the refugees were impolitely asked to leave Russia or were kicked out of it. So they came to Romania, even though they left it great danger, they came back to it because it was still home. Their families were there, and they were hopeful that, you know, the lessons of the war were learned, but obviously they were not. You wrote in the beautiful review of my book that they did not try to capitalize on their communist past. And that is true. This is why I labeled my mother the last socialist. They were truly naive people who wanted to make a better world, but they never really became part of any mechanism of government or a mechanism of even of labor organization. My mother did something with that in Israel, but not in a political way. This is a tragedy. They came back to Romania. It was just before communism, but it was clear that that was coming up. And my father warned his sister to send her son out of Romania. And this son, I will not name him, became a very famous physicist in France. But his education was in Romania. He graduated Polytechnic in Romania, and he took his diploma in Romania. But the great name he made for himself was in France. This was the fate of many Jews, as you probably know.
Yeah. I would also recommend to the Romanian readers who will get this book also to read the pages about the times that Miriam's parents spent in the Soviet Union. I believe that there are some pages about Stalingrad and about the siege of Leningrad. Yes. That are maybe not yet written even in the Russian literature, and they are very worth reading. Maybe one last question, because we are getting towards the end of our...
I thought this will happen. We won't have enough time.
Towards the end of the dialogue, but and this may be a little bit of more a personal question. What did you learn, and how did the documentation and the writing of the book change your feelings about your parents and especially about your father? How did you learn about them?
Well, it changed my feelings completely. First of all, about my mother, I must say, because she was she didn't talk much about most of the things that I discovered during this process of writing. She didn't talk much about it. She had this Romanian façon of keeping the not so nice things out of sight. She had this habit always. You know, in the book I mentioned that my father always had a silk handkerchief in the breast pocket of his suit. Even in the worst of times, there was always a silk handkerchief. And this was typical of my mother. I only realized how terrible it was for her, and that I had a brother, a baby brother who died, in researching for the book, in trying to put together the story. My father was, in a way, an easier thing because I really didn't know him. So I created him from my imagination and from the documents as, you know, the absent hero of literature, a kind of character that I could like, that I could love. And in that sense, although many of the things are historically correct and true and based on fact, many others are figments of my imagination, taking off, you know, on a line or a sentence that my mother told me, or on one of the songs that were his songs that she used to sing to me at night, and taking off from that to imagine a whole scene in the train station and a lifetime of partings and meetings in train stations, which was the fate of many people during that terrible period before the war and during the war. So, you know, here comes my contribution, as it were, to the creation of the image of my father. But he is I did create him in a way that, yes, I came to like him. I came to love him, if you like, as a character.
And it's a memorable character indeed.
Thank you.
And thank you. I believe that we are close to the end. I would just maybe close by inviting the people to buy the book, read the book, and also provide feedback if they are interested. I should also mention the very good translation by Dragoste. It's a beautiful Romanian version. And I would say that we are waiting for your next books, Miriam.
Let me just add one note. When I read this in Romanian, it felt to me like a homecoming, because I've never read a complete novel in Romanian, and this was mine. So in a way, I knew what it was about. In another way, I never imagined it in Romanian. And I was hearing in my mind's ears my mother reading it, imagining her reading it and commenting on it. She was an avid reader and a lover of literature, and she wanted to be a writer, but this never happened. As I said, this whole generation of between the wars had a life postponed.
Right. Thank you, and beautiful it is indeed, and it's beautiful hearing and beautiful reading.
I'm looking forward to getting the reactions of Romanian readers. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Goodbye. La revedere.
Goodbye. La revedere.